Now, how many of you out there just starting your channels are asking the question 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second? If you go on YouTube and check some of the channels out there, a lot of the guys will say 24 frames. If you want to be cinematic and you want to be artistic, 24 frames is what you need. But then you check other channels and you look and they say 30 frames per second. That is the standard. That is what looks most natural to the eye. So we're going to go down that rabbit hole today. So let's do it. Now, there's one thing I wanted to go ahead and discuss with everybody and make sure that we're clear about what I'm talking about today. Is when I'm talking about filming at 24 frames per second, editing or doing my post-production at 24 frames per second, and distribution at 24 frames per second. So when I am referencing today at 24 frames per second, I am referring to that scenario right there. It's the same thing when I talk about 30 frames per second. We're talking about filming in 30 frames per second, editing in 30 frames per second, and then finally doing this distribution in 30 frames per second. 24 frames per second is just 6 frames less than a 30 frames per second. Is it really that much of a difference? But it does make your video or your film look a little more cinematic, more of that little slower look. And if you think about it, a lot of your movies that you see in the theaters or even your music videos are all filmed at 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second kind of gives you that kind of the dreamy look to your video. And it also gives it that higher end look to your video. Now, the downside to 24 frames per second is if you're doing fast motion, you'll get kind of that shuddery look to it. Or if you're doing a handheld with your camera, you'll start to see a little bit more of that shuddering look also with your camera there and when your video is coming out. Now, looking at 30 frames per second, it is the standard rate right now at the current time for videos. And it also makes your video look a little bit smoother than the 24 frames per second. Now, 30 frames per second is mostly seen on YouTube. Hey, right where we're at now. I film most of my stuff doing on YouTube here 30 frames per second. Now, if I'm going to go ahead and do a video where I want to go ahead and give it that cinematic look or something like that, I will go ahead and change it to 24. But you also see it on your newscast, your sitcoms, just regular TV. You'll see it mostly done on 30 frames per second. When doing video editing, and most of the editors out there, 30 frames per second always seems to come out really good, and the editors seem to handle it really well. Now, on the downside, 30 frames per second does not give you that cinematic look, does not look real cinematic. 24 frames per second, if you want to go ahead and slow it down, you can use 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120, if your camera lets you do that. And usually, generally, on the general rule, how you go ahead and break them down is you break it down by about 80% or 40% when you do it at 24. And those generally look really good. Now, 30 frames per second, you want to go ahead and slow that down. Well, again, you can use the 60 frames per second, the 120. And if your camera is permitting, well, heck, do the 240. A lot of the cameras coming out now can actually go up to 240 and slow it down. And the best way to make that one look good is usually slow it down about 50%. Usually comes out pretty good on that one. There's one other thing I want to go ahead and throw in at you. It's the 60 frames per second. A lot of the gamers out there are doing 60 frames per second. Well, when they're doing a lot of the fast action gaming and stuff, that actually looks really good. And a lot of YouTubers have started doing 60 frames per second. But to go ahead and break it down, I don't think 60 frames per second looks really natural. But for today, we're just focusing on the 24 and the 30, so I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole today. 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, that is the big question. But it really always boils down to your personal preference. What do you like? In the 24 frames per second, if you want to go ahead and give it that cinematic look, get some kind of emotions out of it, the artistic side of it, then 24 frames per second is a really good choice. Now we come down to 30 frames per second. If you want your video to look a little bit smoother and more natural, then 30 frames per second is a good choice. Actually, there is no really bad choice. It's actually comes in, again, back down to your personal preference. What are you looking for in your video? Don't go by what everybody else is out there saying and their standards. It's how you as an artist wants to go ahead and project your movie, your video, your YouTube channel, and how you want it. So I hope you liked our little discussion today and talking about the 24 and 30 frames per second. Please go ahead and give a big thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more. I do have a lot more coming at you. So I wanted to thank you today for watching, and have a good day. Thank you.